The morning broke beneath an already stained sky. A deep crimson glow stretched across the hills, bleeding into the low mist that clung to the ground, as though the day itself had risen in anticipation of what was to come. Far below that red horizon, two forces moved toward one another. One marched with purpose. The other waited, with something far more dangerous than numbers. The Western Imperial army advanced in ordered ranks, their banners lifting in the early light as armor caught the rising sun. It was a disciplined force, hardened by war and carried forward by certainty. At its head rode Lord Apys. He had not come for conquest, nor for glory. Everything that drove him forward had been carved into him the night his home was violated, when his wife and child were butchered under his own roof. Every mile since had led him here. Beside Apys rode his surviving son, Aeronix, the last of his bloodline. On the other side of him rode another heir entirely, Thephilos, the son of Emperor Garios himself. Young and far less tested than the men around him, yet there was still iron in him. For the first time, the future of the Western Empire rode to war together. Ahead, the land opened into a wide stretch of field, framed by gentle hills and a thin line of trees beyond. For a moment, it seemed empty. Then the trees stirred. From the shadow of the tree line, soldiers emerged in disciplined ranks. Their banners came into view soon after. Purple, unmistakably imperial, yet defaced. Each one bore the same brutal mark, a black X slashed across the sigil, a rejection of the very empire they once served. It was Crotor's symbol, the same man who had stood in the emperor's own court and cut down his heir without hesitation. The same man who had abandoned law and allegiance alike, carving his own path through fire and blood, most notably at Seonon, where an entire city had paid for his defiance. Now he was horseback again, commanding a force that had chosen to follow him into exile. Apys studied the formation as it tightened before him. A square, compact and disciplined, shields locked, spears angled outward in perfect cohesion. A defensive posture, a desperate one perhaps. Apys did not see a trap. He saw a man cornered. He turned slightly in the saddle. "End this!" The command carried, and the army surged forward. The charge struck with the full weight of the Imperial advance behind it. Western infantry slammed into the square, expecting sheer numbers to tear it apart. But Crotor's formation absorbed the impact without breaking. Spears thrust forward through narrow gaps between shields, while Imperial swords hammered against the wall of men before them. The front ranks collided so tightly that the dead were trapped standing for moments before being dragged beneath the crush. Steel rang through the formation in a suffocating rhythm as more Imperial infantry poured into the assault, forcing their weight against a structure that refused to collapse. Still, Crotor's men held. They gave ground only a step at a time, shifting carefully beneath the pressure, tightening their lines wherever the formation threatened to bend. Every movement was controlled, every thrust measured. Yet, the square endured. Within minutes, the Western army had fully surrounded them. Apys watched it unfold with growing satisfaction. The formation was contained, swallowed whole by his superior numbers. There would be no escape. It would finally end here. Then, a horn blared. The sound carried from somewhere behind the Imperial lines. Apys turned in the saddle, his gaze lifting toward the hills at their rear. At first he saw only the tree line, then movement. Yellow and green banners emerged from the woods in steady waves, riders pushing out from the cover of the trees and forming along the slope beneath the crimson morning sky. rank after rank, appeared behind them until the hillside was lined with mounted warriors staring down at the battlefield below. The sight hit Apys like cold iron. The horse lords had arrived. For a brief moment, the battlefield seemed to pause, as if struggling to reconcile what was unfolding. Inside the encircled square, Crotor began to laugh. The sound carried strangely through the fighting, calm, almost amused, as though the battle unfolding around him had gone exactly as he intended. And in that moment, Apys understood the truth. Crotor had never marched onto this field expecting to survive alone. It was a trap, and he walked right into it. Apys felt it then, the realization settling too late.
Pull back! Pull back now!
But his army was already committed, pressed too tightly against the square to withdraw cleanly. There was no space left to maneuver, no time left to correct the mistake. The horn sounded again, and the riders came down upon them. Hundreds of riders poured down the slope beneath the crimson dawn. Hooves thundered across the earth in rolling waves, shaking the field beneath them as dust and torn grass spiraled behind the charge. The impact shattered what remained of order. The riders struck the flanks with speed and precision, cutting through the outer edges of the Imperial formation, before wheeling away and striking again. Horses slammed into infantry, sending men sprawling, while curved blades flashed in passing arcs that left little time to react. Apys fought to regain control. Some answered. Spears were lowered. Horses fell, tumbling violently and throwing their riders into the fray. But the charge did not falter. For every rider brought down, more pressed forward, flowing around resistance rather than meeting it head-on. The field dissolved into movement and noise, shouting, steel, the heavy thud of bodies striking the ground. What had begun as a controlled assault had become something else entirely. Inside the chaos, Crotor saw the moment he had been waiting for. The order rang out, and the square finally opened. His warriors surged outward into the disoriented Imperial lines, while the horse lords continued crashing into them from the flanks. What had once trapped Crotor's men now trapped the Western army instead, folding it inward beneath the pressure from every direction. The battlefield dissolved almost instantly. Formations collapsed. Officers lost control of their men. Soldiers fought in scattered pockets, surrounded by noise, dust, and bodies, often striking at the nearest figure before they could even recognize whose banner he fought beneath. Near the center of the fighting, Eronix was dragged into the chaos as Crotor cut his way forward through the collapsing lines. The two met only briefly. Eronix swung first, desperate and furious, but Crotor moved through the exchange with terrifying calm. Steel flashed once across the crimson light of morning, then again. Eronix fell beneath him, and above the roar of the battlefield, Crotor laughed. Not far away, Apys heard it. He turned just in time to see his son disappear beneath the crush of fighting men. For a brief instant, the battlefield around him disappeared beneath the weight of it. Then rage took hold, and he drove forward through the chaos with reckless force, cutting down rider after rider in a desperate attempt to reach what remained of his son. Men scattered before him. Others tried to pull him from the saddle and were cut aside for it. But grief had already blinded him to the battle unfolding around him. From somewhere beyond the melee, Monchug Khan emerged at full gallop. The Kuzite ruler came through the fighting with terrifying speed, his long polearm sweeping outward from horseback in a brutal arc. Apys never saw the strike coming. The blade carved into his horse with devastating force, sending both mount and rider crashing violently into the blood-soaked grass below. Dazed and half-stumbling, Apys tried to force himself back into the chaos of the fighting. He never made it. Monchug wheeled his horse around and came at him again, the polearm cutting clean through Apys from behind before he could even turn to face him. And there, amidst the slaughter at the Scarlet Hills, Apys's bloodline came to its end. Thephalos saw Apys fall. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to vanish beneath the shock of it. The screams, the steel, the thunder of hooves, fading into a single terrible image burned into his mind. Lord Apys was dead, Erinix beside him. The men who had led the Western army into battle were gone. Then the chaos returned all at once. Thephalos stood surrounded by the wreckage of what remained, blood running down his armor, his sword still clenched tightly in his hand. Fear was there. Any man would have felt it. But something else held stronger. He did not run. Raising his blade high above the fighting, the young heir shouted for the remaining Imperials to stand their ground.
Stand with me!
The words carried through the collapsing lines, and somehow the men answered. Not because victory still seemed possible. By then, most understood exactly how this battle would end. But the son of Emperor Garios still stood among them, blooded and refusing to yield. So they gathered around him. And there, amidst the slaughter of the Scarlet Hills, the last loyal soldiers of the Western Empire chose to make their final stand beside their future emperor. Crotor saw Thephalos through the chaos of the battlefield, standing amongst the last cluster of Imperial loyalists, still refusing to break. A grin spread across his face. Then he spurred his horse forward. Thephalos saw him coming and turned just before impact. As Crotor raised his blade for the killing strike, the young heir drove his sword into the charging horse. The animal screamed and collapsed beneath its rider, throwing Crotor violently to the ground. But the fallen lord rose almost immediately. Across the battlefield, steel clashed, and men died around them as the two faced one another again, just as they once had in the throne room of the capital. Crotor laughed softly. Blood streaked across his armor.
You should have stayed behind your father's throne.
Then they collided. Thephalos fought with everything still left inside him, his blade striking fast enough to force even Crotor backward across the blood-soaked ground. Steel rang violently between them as the older warrior twisted aside from one strike after another, searching for an opening while the young heir drove forward through fury, grief, and desperation. For a moment, it almost seemed possible, as though the son of Garios might actually kill the man who had shattered the empire. Then, Crotor adapted. He slipped past a strike, turned sharply inside Thephalos' guard, and drove his blade into the young heir's body. Thephalos staggered. His sword fell from his hand, and there, amidst the dead of the Scarlet Hills, the heir to the Western Empire collapsed into the mud beside the men who had died protecting him. What remained of the Western army did not survive much longer. They fought as soldiers do, even when the outcome was certain. But they were surrounded, broken, and outmatched. One by one, they fell. By the time the fighting ended, the hills had changed. The red that had greeted the morning no longer only belonged to the sky. It belonged to the ground. Bodies lay scattered across the slope, marking the place where an army had been undone, where a bloodline had ended, and where alliances had reshaped the course of the war in a single, decisive moment. Word of what happened there would spread, carried across Calradia in fragments and rumor before settling into truth. The Western Empire had been broken. Crotor had survived, and the Horse Lords had made their presence known. From that day forward, those hills would bear a new name, the Scarlet Hills, and the consequences of what was done there would not remain contained to that field. They would ripple outward through kingdoms, through alliances, through the rest of the war itself.